It was past 2 in the morning when I made my way down to the basement of my grandfather's house in Houston. The house was quiet, the only sound the low hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the old floorboards above. My grandfather had asked me to check on his old bomb shelter, a relic from decades ago, to see if any water had seeped in during the recent storms. I wasn't sure why he didn't want to check it himself, but he had been clear. I was to look carefully, note any signs of damage, and make sure the door seals were still intact. The thought of an old shelter in a basement didn't bother me much at first. I'd explored similar spaces before, abandoned attics, storage rooms, but the idea that this was a fully sealed shelter made it feel different. Serious. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, the rail worn smooth from years of use. I flicked on my flashlight and let the beam cut through the darkness as I descended. The air was already thick and cool, smelling faintly of damp concrete and mildew. At the bottom, the basement opened into a larger room, mostly unfinished, with a workbench, boxes stacked along the walls, and the faint outline of old furniture under tarps. But my attention immediately went to the shelter door. It was made of steel, heavy, and clearly built to withstand far more than the occasional storm. It was a dull gray, scratched and slightly rusted along the edges, with a round wheel lock that hadn't been turned in years. I ran my hand over the metal. It was cold, smooth, and solid, and pulled the wheel. It resisted at first, groaning like it hadn't been moved in decades, then shifted with a loud click. The smell from inside hit me before I even opened the door fully. Stale air, metallic tang, a faint scent of old cardboard and dust. I switched on the flashlight fully and stepped inside. The shelter was larger than I expected. Shelves lined the walls, heavy with canned food, jars of pickled vegetables, and bags of dried beans. In the center, a small table with a few chairs leaned against one another, coated in dust. Cobwebs stretched between the corners of shelves, shimmering faintly in the flashlight's beam. The floor was concrete, uneven in places, and small puddles reflected my light, though they looked shallow. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, carrying a faint echo every time I moved. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I started at the far end, inspecting the walls for water damage. My flashlight swept over the concrete, tracing the lines where the walls met the floor, over the shelves, under the table. Everything looked dry at first glance, though the musty smell made it clear the air had been trapped for a long time. I ran my hands over the walls, feeling for dampness or softness. The surface was solid, cool, and unyielding. I moved slowly, letting my light catch every corner. The shadows cast by the shelves seemed to stretch farther than they should, and I felt a strange awareness of the space, like the shelter was far larger than its physical limits suggested. I bent down to inspect a lower shelf when I heard it. The door slammed. Hard. The echo bounced off the walls, and the metallic clang lingered longer than it should have. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around and tried the door. It wouldn't budge. The wheel had turned slightly in my hand, but refused to release. I pressed against it, pushing with all my strength, but the heavy steel held fast. Panic settled into the pit of my stomach. I was alone, the air stale and thick, and the exit I had counted on had vanished behind me. Then I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible shuffling from the far corner of the shelter. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Boxes shifted, a soft scrape against the concrete floor. My first thought was that a rat had gotten loose. But the sound was too deliberate, too heavy, the movement too measured for a rodent. I called out, my voice sharp in the silence, telling whoever, or whatever, it was that I was there. Nothing. The shuffling continued, occasionally stopping, then starting again like someone pacing, moving something around. My light swept across the room and caught a shape crouched near the shelves. I froze. At first, it looked like a pile of boxes or old furniture, but the movement betrayed it. Limbs jerked in angles that seemed wrong, a stiff, unnatural rhythm. Not human, but not entirely random either. My brain struggled to make sense of it, twisting reality to explain what I was seeing. There was no one else in the house. My grandfather was asleep upstairs. The streets outside were empty. It had to be a trick of the shadows, my own mind playing games in the dim light. I tried to rationalize, shaking my head, telling myself it was a chair falling, a stack of cans shifting. But my instincts screamed at me that something was wrong. I moved cautiously toward the side of the shelter, scanning for anything that could serve as an escape. That's when I noticed it, a small hatch, almost hidden behind a shelf of cans. It was old, metal, and rusted around the edges. I dropped to my knees, prying at it with my hands. The latch resisted, stiff with years of disuse, but finally gave way with a shriek of metal on metal. A small opening led to a narrow crawl space that smelled of dirt and rust. I didn't hesitate. I slid my body through the hatch, scraping my hands and knees along the rough edges, hearing the faint, erratic scuttling behind me. I kept moving, crawling through the tight space until I found an opening leading back into the main basement. I pushed myself out into the open air of the basement proper, chest heaving, flashlight shaking in my grip. My heart was pounding, my skin slick with sweat. The shelter door was still sealed, silent now, as if nothing had happened. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, feeling the texture of the rail in my palms, the worn steps under my shoes, until I reached the main floor. The house was quiet, the air still, the faint hum of the air conditioner blending with my ragged breathing. I leaned against the wall, trying to collect myself, flashlight still on, eyes scanning every shadow. Later, after I had calmed down enough to think clearly, I retraced my steps mentally. The shelter had been locked and untouched for years, filled only with my grandfather's old supplies. The only way anyone could have been inside was if they had been living there unnoticed, but the basement was a sealed space, and the front door of the house had been locked from the inside. There was no one else in the house, no hidden entrances I could find. I checked the basement thoroughly, shining my light into every dark corner, every storage nook. Nothing. Just dust, boxes, old furniture, and the lingering metallic, stale smell of the shelter. I left the house that morning and didn't speak to anyone about what had happened. I told myself it was a trick of the mind, stress and low lighting creating shadows that my brain misinterpreted. Still, every time I think about it, I remember the jerky movement of the shape in the corner, the way it seemed to occupy the space like it had always been there, and how the hatch had been the only way out. I realize now that the shelter, built for safety, had almost trapped me inside, and whatever I thought I saw was either a figment or a warning of just how confined and vulnerable that space could make a person feel. My grandfather eventually had the shelter cleaned out and checked thoroughly, just in case, but nothing unusual was ever found. No damage, no hidden passages, no intruders. The incident remains my own, a memory etched in my mind each time I consider the nature of closed, enclosed spaces. There is a weight in that memory, a visceral reminder of how small and fragile one can feel when trapped, alone, and uncertain. Every time I pass the basement stairs now, I hesitate briefly, thinking of the cool steel of the door, the stale metallic air, and the shuffling in the far corner that may never have existed, or may have existed in a way I'll never understand. Even years later, I still remember the sound of the door slamming, the sudden darkness pressing in, and the frantic, jerky movement of whatever it was crouched in the corner of that forgotten shelter. It was a lesson in caution, in awareness, and in the quiet terror of being alone in a space built to keep people safe, yet capable of holding someone in more effectively than they could imagine. The shelter had been designed for survival, but for a few minutes, it became something else entirely, a place of panic, of confinement, and of the unknowable. I can never enter a basement without that memory pressing against my mind, a silent warning of what isolation can do to perception and fear. I remember that night in June 2019 with more clarity than I like to admit. I had woken up around 2:30 in the morning to gather a box of old tax records my mom had insisted I organize. The house was quiet in that way that makes every creak and draft sound louder. The air was humid, sticky against my skin from the day's heat lingering in the walls. The basement door was in the corner of the hallway, behind a coat rack and a small bench where I usually left my shoes. I paused for a moment, staring at the small, locked storage room within the basement. I had never been inside. The key was always missing, and my mom had told me to leave it alone. But the box I needed was somewhere in there, she said, and I didn't want to wait until morning. I had picked locks before, never anything complicated, just enough to get into old desk drawers or cabinets, but this was different. The door felt heavier, the lock sturdier. I laid the tools on the floor, the flathead screwdriver and a small tension wrench, and started. My fingers were slick with sweat almost immediately, and the faint whir of the ceiling fan above the finished section of the basement seemed too loud. After a few tense minutes, the lock clicked. I froze, expecting some immediate alarm, but the silence held. I pulled the door open slowly, feeling the resistance of rusted hinges. The smell hit me first, a thick, choking mix of wet carpet, old wood, and something sour that I couldn't place. It clung to my clothes instantly, a cold dampness that seemed to seep into my skin. The basement light flickered as I stepped inside. The finished section ended abruptly at the threshold of the storage area. Concrete walls lined the small room, painted in a peeling beige that made everything feel dimmer. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling, stacked with cardboard boxes, some of them sagging under their own weight, corners torn and warped by moisture. The floor was uneven, the concrete cold beneath my socks, and dust coated every surface. I squinted at the boxes, trying to find the one with the tax records. They were all labeled in fading marker. Christmas decorations, old clothes, garage sale stuff. Nothing that seemed urgent. I shifted my weight and reached for one of the boxes near the back, the cardboard crunching beneath my fingers. My hand brushed against another box, labeled taxes 2015 to 2018. That had to be it. I lifted it toward me, feeling the rough edges scrape against my forearms. That's when I heard it. A soft, dragging noise from behind me. I froze. The box was heavy in my hands, but I could feel every vibration in the floor. I told myself it was a rat or a mouse, something small scuttling over debris. But the sound continued, deliberate. It moved in uneven steps, pauses that made my stomach tighten. My heart started to hammer in my chest. I dropped the box. The cardboard landed on the concrete floor with a muffled thump. The dragging noise stopped immediately. For a moment, I thought the sound might have been in my head, a trick of the darkness and my own panic. I swallowed and tried to steady my breathing. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom in a narrow cone, illuminating dust motes in the stagnant air. The shelves were emptying themselves of shadows one by one, but there was nothing there, nothing moving, nothing alive. And yet, I could hear breathing. Not mine. Slow, uneven, deliberate, almost synchronized with the sound of my own heartbeat. I held the flashlight steady, sweeping the beam across the boxes, the floor, the walls. I didn't see anything. Still, my stomach churned, and my hands shook so badly that the flashlight wavered. I felt exposed, small in the space, the ceiling pressing down, the air thick and stale. I backed toward the stairs. My eyes were straining to pierce the shadows behind the shelves. The sound didn't resume immediately, but I knew it could at any moment. I tried to convince myself that someone was inside the house, someone who had followed me into the basement, someone curious, careless, or maybe reckless enough to hide in a storage room that had been locked for years. I reached the stair railing, my hand gripping the cold metal, and I glanced once more over my shoulder. My light caught something near the far corner of the room, where a pile of flattened boxes leaned against the wall. For a split second, a shape shifted there, a dark smudge that moved against the concrete like it had weight. Then it vanished. Panic hit me fully. I turned and ran, hands scraping against the railing, my socks sliding against the concrete steps. The sound of the door latching behind me was the only thing I focused on, the echoing click like a final punctuation. My chest burned, lungs heaving, and I stayed pressed against the top of the stairs, staring at the storage room door, waiting for anything to move. My flashlight still clutched in my hand. I felt the cool sweat running down my back. The basement was silent now, but the air felt heavier, the smell lingering longer. I didn't move until my heart slowed enough that I could think clearly. Later, in the daylight, I went back down, careful this time, with a different plan. I swept the finished basement, checking for any signs of what I thought I had heard. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, muddied tracks in the dust, leading from the shelves near the far corner, following a crooked line between the boxes and disappearing behind them. The prints were small, no larger than a child's shoe, and they were still damp, as if the mud had come from outside. They didn't continue beyond the line of boxes. I traced them with my finger, feeling the ridges of dried dirt, the way the prints pressed into the dust on the floor. I had no idea where they had gone. No doors, no hidden exits. Just a locked storage room that had been sealed for years. I went back upstairs, locked the main basement door this time, and told myself I wouldn't think about it. I moved the tax box to my room, sorting it on the desk, filing papers carefully, but the image of the storage room and the dragging, deliberate sound stayed with me. I never went back at night. Not for months. The house felt different after that night. The basement seemed deeper, darker. The shadows in the corners of the finished section felt heavier. I never saw the footprints again, and I never found anything missing or out of place, except for the faint mud stain that remained on the floor near the corner where the boxes had been shifted. Eventually, I moved the tax files upstairs and gave up trying to unlock the storage room again. I never found an explanation. The house was old, the basement was damp, the shadows played tricks, maybe rats had found a way in, maybe a neighbor's kid had sneaked down. But none of that explained the slow, deliberate breathing I heard, the way the sound followed me step by step, or the footprints leading away as if something had been there and vanished into the darkness. I learned to leave certain doors locked, certain rooms alone, and to trust the quiet weight of the house at night. The basement stayed the same, just old concrete, cardboard boxes, and peeling paint. And I stayed upstairs, far from the smell of wet carpet and the uncertainty that hid behind the locked storage door. Even now, I can still see the shadows in my mind, the small prints in the dust, and hear that sound just behind me, moving carefully, waiting, deliberate. It's the kind of memory that doesn't fade, not fully, no matter how many times I tell myself it was just a mistake, just imagination, or just old house noises. It's the kind of memory that reminds you that even in a familiar place, with no one else around, you're never entirely alone. I had been washing clothes all evening, stacking them carefully on the dining room table, folding the jeans and towels, separating socks as I went. When I went to retrieve a stray sock that had slipped behind the dryer in my apartment, I didn't think much of it. It was a small thing, an ordinary white ankle sock, but it had vanished somewhere between the wash and the folding, and I didn't like leaving things unfinished. The basement laundry room was at the end of a narrow hallway, tucked under the building's main staircase. I had gone down there dozens of times before, usually in daylight or with a neighbor coming and going, and it had always felt slightly unkempt but harmless. The walls were cinder block, painted a pale gray that had faded unevenly over the years. The concrete floor had hairline cracks and a few dark stains that smelled faintly of mold, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered in long, uneven cycles, throwing strange shadows against the machines and storage shelves. That night, January in New York had brought the kind of bitter cold that made the city's streets sparkle with frost, and I had bundled myself in a thick coat and scarf. When I opened the basement door, a rush of warm, humid air hit me, scented sharply of detergent and mildew. I paused for a moment on the top step, listening to the faint humming of the washing machines and dryers. Even with the building quiet, that low, constant vibration filled the small space and felt oddly alive. I reminded myself it was nothing but machines. I had been here before, alone, and nothing had ever felt dangerous. I moved down the stairs slowly, careful of the slick concrete, my sock clutched loosely in my hand. The machines were arranged along the walls in rows, top-load washers lined up opposite front-load dryers. Metal laundry carts leaned against the walls, empty except for a few stray lint balls. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, and one in particular flickered almost continuously, making a faint, uneven strobe effect over the gray walls. The scent of mildew was stronger near the far corner, where a floor drain was stained brown with rust, and an old mop bucket had been left overnight. I felt the usual quiet unease that came from being underground in a small, enclosed space, but it was the sort of unease I had learned to ignore. I crouched down near the dryer where I had last seen the missing sock. The air here was heavier, warmer, and slightly damp. I reached under the dryer slowly, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the machine's base, my palm pressing against the dusty floor. That's when I felt it, a soft, slightly sticky touch against the side of my hand. I jerked back immediately, heart slamming. My hand felt damp and faintly gritty, like it had brushed something wet and coated in soap residue. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Nothing but the shadows cast by the flickering lights, stretching across the floor and walls. I froze, every instinct telling me to leave, but my curiosity, stupidly, held me in place for a few seconds longer. The shadows seemed to move as the light stuttered, a shape crossing the far wall that didn't match any of the machines or laundry carts. My chest tightened, and I realized I could hear the hum of the machines as if it had gotten louder, or maybe my own pulse had caught up with me. I took a small step backward, trying to shake off the sensation, and the fluorescent lights went into a violent flicker, stuttering so fast it made the shadows jump and shiver on the walls. I didn't wait. My body reacted before my mind could process anything. I bolted toward the stairs, skidding slightly on the smooth concrete, hands gripping the railing. The door at the top seemed impossibly far away, each step echoing in the narrow stairwell. When I reached it and pushed it open, the chill of the hallway greeted me, sharp and clean. My heart was still racing, sweat making my coat cling to my back. I slammed the door shut and realized, with a slow sinking in my chest, that the basement door didn't lock from the inside. I tried the handle experimentally, jiggling it, and it swung freely. I felt the unease settle into a deeper place in my body, an awareness that I had been in that basement entirely alone, entirely exposed, and the sock, of course, had disappeared again. I double-checked every lock in my apartment that night, sliding deadbolts into place, twisting latches, running my hand along the metal of each lock to make sure it held. Even as I did, I felt the memory of the brush against my hand under the dryer, soft and wet, lingering in my mind. It wasn't something I could explain. There was nothing supernatural, nothing that made sense, just the way the basement smelled, the uneven light, the movement of shadows, and that impossible sensation against my skin. Over the next few weeks, I avoided the basement unless I had no choice. The laundry piled in my apartment grew larger, and each time I approached the basement door, I felt a tightening in my chest, the same shiver of nerves I had felt that night. I tried to tell myself it was just the light flickering, a draft moving across the floor, the sound of the machines echoing strangely in the empty space. But my hands shook every time I used the door handle, and every time I descended the stairs, the smell of detergent and mildew seemed stronger, more invasive. I would glance at the far wall instinctively, half expecting shadows to slither across it. It stayed with me, not as terror, but as an awareness that the basement was a place where something could happen, or at least feel like it could. Months later, I would pass the door on my way to the kitchen or the hallway closet, and I would still pause, hand brushing the cool metal of the knob, checking the lock even though I knew it held. I never found that sock, not in the basement, not in the laundry carts, not in any forgotten corners. It was a trivial loss, but the memory of the sensation, the wet brush of something against my hand, remained sharp. Eventually, I began to rebuild a routine, moving laundry in stages, leaving socks for the moment until I had company to help sort or folding in daylight when the basement felt less oppressive. Still, the memory never faded. I knew that nothing had physically harmed me, that the basement was just a basement cold and damp, with flickering lights and humming machines. But I also knew that the sense of being watched, of contact where none could exist, was real in its effect, shaping the way I approached that space forever. The locks, the careful pacing, the avoidance, those became habits, small acts of control over an environment that had reminded me how easily the ordinary could feel threatening. I never returned to the basement that night, or at least not alone, and the sensation never returned once I stopped going down unaccompanied. In a strange way, that small sock, lost under a dryer, had become the catalyst for a careful awareness of my surroundings, a way of noticing the edges of normal life where something could brush against you without warning. The basement never changed. It smelled of detergent and mildew, the lights continued to flicker, and the machines hummed. The door still wouldn't lock from the inside. But I had learned, in the most ordinary and unsettling way, that even a place as mundane as a laundry room could hold a lingering presence in your mind long after you had left it behind. And the memory stayed with me every time I passed that door. I remember that night in September 2017 as if it had left a permanent stain in my memory. My friends and I were camping in a rural stretch of Oregon, somewhere far from paved roads, where the trees pressed in and the fog settled low in the valleys. The sky had been gray all evening, and a steady rain began just after sunset. We had pitched our tents near an old farmhouse that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The wood was warped and rotting, paint peeled in long strips, windows shattered, and the front porch sagged like it was ready to collapse under its own weight. We had laughed nervously when we spotted it, joking that it was perfect shelter if the rain got worse. By midnight, the rain was relentless, drumming on our tents, soaking the ground until it was thick mud. We had grown cold and tired, the storm washing out any plans to sit around a fire. The farmhouse seemed like the only option. None of us were eager to go inside, but the need for dryness outweighed the unease that prickled the back of our necks. We pushed the front door open. It was heavy and warped, and immediately felt the smell. Damp wood, mold, rot, and something metallic mixed into the air. The floor sagged underfoot, creaking with each step, and the walls were streaked with water, old graffiti, and scratches so deep that some of them exposed raw, dark timber. The main floor was mostly empty, littered with broken furniture and debris. A staircase led down to the basement, and we hesitated. The rain had made the ground slippery, and the steps were coated in mud from years of neglect. Still, it was a basement, a space that might keep us safe and dry. I went first, careful to place my feet on the dry spots. When my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw that it was half flooded. Water covered the floor unevenly, pooling in some corners and leaving wooden beams slick and slick. The walls were caked with grime and graffiti, names, dates, crude drawings, and the scratches continued down there, long gouges in the stone that looked like they had been made with nails or claws. My friends followed behind me, each of us muttering reassurances to ourselves that it was just stories we had heard about the place, that nothing dangerous could live here. We explored cautiously, trying to find a dry corner where we could huddle together. The water was cold, soaking our shoes and pants, and every movement made the floor moan or groan. I noticed shadows stretching across the walls, distorted by the uneven light and the puddles, and at first, I blamed the shapes on my imagination. The basement had a strange geometry. Low ceilings in some spots, high in others, the corners deep and dark. It was in one of those corners, away from where the others were standing, that I first noticed something moving. I froze. At first, I thought it was another shadow, but then the shape shifted in a way that didn't make sense. It was thin, far taller than any person should be when crouched. Its movements were jerky, uneven, not fluid like a human. Something about the way it positioned itself and turned made me feel that it wasn't just hiding, it was watching. I swallowed hard, the water around my ankles rippling slightly as I tried to back away. The rest of the group hadn't noticed. The figure's eyes were faintly glowing, not like any reflection I had ever seen, more like pinpoints of light. They locked on mine, and for a second the air felt heavy. I tried to focus on the details, trying to convince myself that this was just a trick of the low light, some reflection off the damp walls, anything rational. But the shape was real. It hissed softly, a wet, guttural sound that made my stomach twist, and then it backed into the shadows along the far wall. Its movements were too precise, too deliberate, too wrong to be human. The fear hit all at once. My heart was hammering, my hands shaking, and I felt the cold sweat stick to my skin. Without thinking, I turned to the staircase and bolted, splashing through the water and mud. My friends followed behind me, tripping over debris, slipping in the slick puddles. We barely made it out of the basement before someone lost their footing entirely, sliding into the doorway with a grunt. We didn't stop to help. We scrambled out into the rain, breathing hard, clothes soaked, hearts racing. Outside, the farmhouse looked different, almost alive in its decay, with the dim light of the storm reflecting off the broken windows. I kept glancing back, certain I would see the figure standing at a window or emerging from the doorway. My skin prickled, and I felt a cold tension that didn't go away. The strange sense of being watched persisted, even as we made it to higher ground, back among the trees. I could see the basement window through the rain, the black rectangle in the wall, and for minutes I was convinced I saw movement just inside it, as if whatever had been down there was tracking us. We didn't speak for a while. The storm drowned out our words anyway, and the adrenaline made it hard to form coherent sentences. Eventually, we set up our tents farther away from the farmhouse, where the trees could give us some cover, but I didn't sleep. Every sound, the rain hammering leaves, a branch breaking, the distant call of an owl, made me startle. My mind replayed the image over and over, the tall, thin shape, the glowing eyes, the jerky motion. I tried to rationalize it, thinking of stray dogs, raccoons, or a deer, but nothing fit. The figure had crouched like it was preparing to spring, and its limbs were too long, too rigid. By morning, the rain had eased, leaving the ground muddy and the air crisp. I didn't want to go near the farmhouse. My friends, ever braver or more careless than me, suggested checking it out in daylight, but I refused. I wanted nothing more than to leave the area. When I looked back toward the old structure, the basement window was empty, but the scratches on the walls and the graffiti still carried that feeling of recent disturbance. Whoever, or whatever, had been down there had not been idle. The rest of the day was a blur of packing and moving through the wet forest. I couldn't shake the memory of that basement. Every small sound made me tense, and I kept imagining the figure crouched somewhere, waiting, watching. Even driving away from the site later, I caught glimpses of shapes in the corner of my eye. The way a tree's branch swayed, the dark hollow of a culvert. My mind kept returning to that half-flooded basement, and the glowing eyes that had tracked me. I never went back. I didn't need to. The memory stayed vivid enough. I think about it sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet and the shadows stretch across my walls. I imagine the figure still there, crouched in the corner, moving in its strange, jerky way, waiting in that same half-flooded basement under the old farmhouse. I know it isn't supernatural. It was a living thing, something real, something human-like but not human, something capable of hiding in the dark for decades without anyone noticing. That realization makes it worse. It has changed how I think about abandoned places, how I move through forests at night, and how I trust my instincts. There is a clarity that comes with having seen something like that. You learn immediately which stories are cautionary truths. The memory is sharp, and the details remain. The cold water seeping into my shoes, the smell of mold and rot, the graffiti-covered walls, the scratches etched into stone, the unnatural posture, the faint glow of those eyes, the hiss. I know it was real because my body remembers it. My body reacted before my mind had a chance to rationalize. Even years later, I replay that basement in my mind with startling precision. I remember the angles of the corners, the slope of the floor, the way water reflected the faint light, the smell of decay that lingered in the wet wood. I remember stepping carefully over a broken chair and feeling the water shift under my weight. I remember the silence after the hiss, the way everything seemed to hold its breath, waiting. That silence was worse than the figure itself. I have never returned to that farmhouse, and I don't intend to. The thought of it sitting there, empty and quiet, basement half-flooded, walls scrawled with marks of people who had come before, makes my skin crawl. I have told a few close friends what happened, always careful to leave out embellishments. The story doesn't need them. The fear I felt is enough. The strange, impossible shape crouched in the shadows, moving with intent, is enough. The basement exists in my memory as a single, unbroken scene, every detail intact. I can see the figure in my mind without trying, can feel the chill of the water, the sharp odor, the claustrophobic weight of the dark corners. I know it watched us leave, and I have no doubt it remains there, moving in its own unnatural rhythm, hiding in the shadows, still waiting. It isn't a ghost, and it isn't a story. It was real, and that reality is what continues to unsettle me whenever I think back. The farmhouse will crumble eventually, but the basement, the water, the scratches, and the figure's memory will not fade from my mind. I have learned to respect those spaces now, to avoid abandoned basements, to avoid the temptation of curiosity when something clearly does not want to be found. That night, standing in the cold, half-flooded basement with that figure watching, I realized how fragile a sense of safety can be, how quickly the familiar turns into danger. I never needed proof after that night. The basement told me everything I needed to know. I will never forget it, and I hope I never see anything like it again, because the clarity of that fear is something I can still feel, even years later, like a shadow pressing against my own eyes when I close them. I do not know what it was, and I do not want to know. It was alive, it was there, and it saw me. That is enough. I don't think curiosity is worth testing against the kind of presence I felt that night. I am not interested in returning to confirm it, because confirmation would come at too high a cost. It is enough to know that it exists, that the basement holds its secrets, and that for a brief, terrifying moment, I was directly in its space and witnessed it exactly as it was. And that is a truth I carry with me, clear, unembellished, and entirely real. Even now, when I pass old farmhouses or see windows dark and water-stained, I think of that basement. I picture the figure crouched in the corner, waiting, patient, precise, and entirely indifferent to the passage of time. It does not move unless it chooses, and I know I was merely an intruder. That thought stays with me, heavier than any rain-soaked memory, and I do not want to test it again. I have seen it once, and that is enough. I woke up to the sound before I even opened my eyes. At first, I thought it was the old pipes settling, the kind of creaks and groans a house my age produces without warning. But then it repeated, softer this time, almost like words I wasn't meant to understand. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear. The air was heavy with the chill of a December night in Detroit, the kind that seeps through thin windows and the cracked edges of old doors. I was alone. My roommate was out of town for the week. The apartment felt quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes ordinary noises seem urgent. I told myself it was nothing, that the house was just old, but the thought of the basement made my stomach tighten. The noise had come from below. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. Its beam was narrow, harsh against the dark, but at least it could reach the corners. I crept across the floorboards, careful to avoid the spots that always creaked under weight. The stairwell to the basement looked worse than I remembered in the daylight. Shadows stretching across the peeling paint on the walls, the handrails splintered in places. The stairs themselves were steep, the wood worn smooth in the middle, groaning with every tentative step I took. I gripped the railing tightly, the coolness of it making my fingers numb, and descended slowly, counting the steps in my head. About halfway down, the whispering started. It was quiet at first, almost imperceptible, like someone talking in a different room, too far away to make sense of the words. I froze, listening. The air smelled damp, earthy, like the walls had absorbed years of moisture. The beam of my flashlight wavered as I moved it across the floor, and for a second, the flickering made it hard to tell where the shadows ended and the walls began. My heart beat too fast, but I told myself it was just nerves. Maybe a draft had caught the door upstairs. Maybe the pipes were acting up. When I reached the bottom, the whispering was clearer, still impossible to decipher, but it had a rhythm, like someone was pacing behind an invisible barrier. I scanned the basement with the light. Boxes lined the walls, old furniture stacked haphazardly, a few cobwebs stretching across corners. The concrete floor was slick in places, damp from some unknown leak. I could see the fuse box against the far wall, the source of my errand, but moving toward it felt heavier with every step. Then I heard it, the footsteps. They weren't slow. They were fast, running across the concrete floor behind me. My stomach dropped. I spun around, the flashlight swinging wildly, but the basement was empty. No shadows moved beyond the angle of the beam. My chest was tight, breath short, and I realized I was gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles hurt. Every rational part of me told myself it was an echo, that the sound had bounced off the walls, but another part of me refused to believe that. The footsteps had definite directionality, a pace and urgency no echo could mimic. I forced myself to keep moving, toward the fuse box. My hand shook as I lifted the metal cover, inspecting the wires. Everything looked normal. Nothing was tripped, no burnt marks or signs of malfunction. My mind raced, trying to justify the fear creeping into my bones. The whispering continued, now low, intermittent, almost teasing in how close it seemed without ever revealing itself. I took a deep breath and checked the surrounding area, the flashlight sweeping across shadows and corners, my ears straining to catch the next sound. The damp floor made the air smell heavier, more oppressive, like the basement had swallowed something and refused to give it back. I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, darting around the far side of the basement. I didn't wait to investigate. My feet hit the stairs hard, the wooden boards groaning under the sudden weight. The whispering followed, faint now, almost mocking, echoing up the stairwell. I reached the top and slammed the basement door behind me, locking it. My hand stayed on the knob for a long time, reluctant to let go. The house felt impossibly quiet after the basement door closed, but the whispers didn't stop. They lingered faint, almost imperceptible, like the air itself was carrying them. I moved back to the living room, sitting on the couch and wrapping myself in a blanket. The flashlight rested beside me, the beam catching the walls, the corners of the room. I tried to reason with myself, to accept that it was a combination of old house noises and the nervousness of being alone, but the memory of the running footsteps refused to let that logic settle. My mind played over every sound, every shadow. Even the way the paint peeled on the walls and the stairwell seemed sinister now, like it had been waiting for someone to notice. Hours passed, and I didn't sleep. I watched the time on my phone, every hour feeling longer than the last. The whispering stopped eventually, or maybe I just stopped hearing it, numbed by the constant tension. I didn't go back to the basement that night. When my roommate returned, I considered mentioning it, but there was no physical evidence, no way to prove anything. The basement was still damp in corners, the stairs still steep and creaky, the walls still covered in peeling paint. I told myself I would check the fuse box again in the daylight, but even with the lights on, the basement felt heavier, uninviting. I never figured out what caused the noises. Plumbing, drafts, the house settling. It could have been any of those things, but the memory of the footsteps, so definite, so fast, lingered in my mind. I learned to avoid the basement at night, only going down during the day, moving quickly and keeping the door open when I could. I stopped leaving the house alone for long periods, always carrying my phone. The basement became a place to pass by quickly, a narrow hallway of shadows I acknowledged but never lingered in. Even months later, I sometimes hear a faint whisper in the middle of the night, when everything else is still. It's enough to make me pause, to remember the damp floor, the flickering lights, the sudden running behind me. The house hasn't changed, but the way I feel in it has. The basement is still there, dark and steep, with peeling paint and damp concrete, and I've accepted that some noises can't be explained, or at least not in a way that makes the fear go away. I've walked past that door countless times, always alert, always careful. I've accepted that the house will keep its secrets, and I will keep my distance. The whispering might never have a source, and maybe that's exactly what keeps it real. I went down to the basement that night knowing it would take me longer than I wanted. My dad's workshop had always felt heavy and closed in, the kind of space that smells of itself, a mixture of oil, rust, and old wood, with dust that settles on everything and refuses to leave. The concrete floor was uneven, and the walls were cracked in several places, paint peeling in long, curling strips. I carried a flashlight in one hand and a box of miscellaneous hand tools in the other, trying to ignore the way the light stretched shadows along the low ceiling beams and across the stacks of lumber and old farm equipment. The bare bulb in the center of the room hummed faintly and gave off a yellow glare that seemed to make everything darker rather than lighter. I started with the boxes near the back wall. They were labeled in my dad's handwriting, in fading black marker that was nearly illegible in places. I set one down, opened it, and began sorting wrenches, pliers, and hammers. The smell of oil and rust was stronger here, almost choking me for a moment as I inhaled too deeply. The floor was cold and slightly damp beneath my shoes, a reminder that even though the house was old, it still had a foundation that leaked sometimes. I worked slowly, making piles on a nearby workbench, running my fingers along metal that was cold and rough. The edges nipped at my skin in small ways that made me flinch. It was quiet except for the soft hum of the bulb and the occasional creak of the floorboards above. I heard a small thump, a light but distinct sound from the corner behind the lumber stack. I froze for a moment, trying to decide if I had imagined it. The sound came again, soft but deliberate. My first thought was a raccoon or a mouse, anything small that had found its way into the basement. I bent down to pick up a wrench that had rolled onto the floor, the metal clinking against the concrete. The thumping grew louder, closer, as if whatever it was had noticed me moving. I straightened and swept my flashlight across the room, letting the beam drift over the stacks of wood and the shelves. Shadows stretched and jumped along the walls, caused by the uneven light and the angles of the piles of lumber and boxes. That's when I noticed a pair of eyes catching the light from under the workbench, low to the floor, reflecting back at me. They were small and sharp, moving quickly, and then they vanished, darting out of sight. I felt a spike of panic, but told myself it had to be a rat. I kept the flashlight on as I worked, trying to move the tools more quickly, to finish the sorting. Every time I reached for a box, the thumping resumed somewhere else in the basement, a shift of weight or movement that kept me from relaxing. My mind kept flicking back to the eyes under the workbench, wondering what exactly had been there, and if it had come back while I wasn't looking. I tried not to make any sudden movements, but my hands were sweating and my heart was starting to beat faster than normal. The floor was uneven in places, and I stumbled slightly as I moved toward another pile of boxes. The thumping was now clearly moving along the wall, a slow, dragging sound that made my stomach twist. I thought about grabbing a broom or something to defend myself if needed, but the idea of reaching for a tool while keeping the flashlight on and watching for movement seemed impossible. The beam caught glimpses of shadows that didn't belong to anything I could see clearly. Every stack of wood, every crate, suddenly looked like it could be hiding something alive. I realized that even though I had been careful, the flashlight was casting sharp shadows that made everything seem larger and closer than it was. The thumping was now punctuated by faint scratches, like claws scraping across the floor. I froze, holding the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles went white. The sound moved again, right along the perimeter of the workbench where the eyes had been, then paused, as if whatever it was sizing me up. My brain told me it was a rat or a group of rats, but the dragging weight of the sound didn't match a normal rat. It was heavier, deliberate. I decided I had had enough. My hands shaking, I set the last box down and tried to walk toward the stairs. As I lifted the flashlight, I thought I caught a movement at the far corner, near the old freezer that hadn't been used in years. Something shifted, low and fast, slipping between stacks of lumber. My stomach dropped. I broke into a careful jog toward the stairs, trying not to trip on the uneven floor. The thumping followed, keeping pace with me now, the dragging sounds echoing off the walls and ceiling. It was close enough that I could hear the scuff of feet or claws, or maybe a combination, on the concrete. I reached the stairs and scrambled up, leaving the light on behind me. The thumping followed for a few steps onto the landing, and I could hear it moving along the first-floor floorboards as I ran toward the kitchen. I stopped in the center of the room, breathing hard, my ears straining for anything that would tell me I was safe. Nothing came. The basement was silent again, but the memory of the sound lingered, heavy and wet in my mind. The next day, my dad came down to check on the workshop while I was having breakfast. He laughed when I told him about the noises, brushing it off as rats. He even suggested I had imagined the eyes under the workbench. I followed him down to show him the areas I had been working, and the basement looked the same as always, dusty, cluttered, and smelling of oil and rust. There were no signs of large animals, and nothing had moved from where I left it. I could feel some relief in seeing the basement again in daylight, but the memory of the sounds at night, the dragging, the shifting of something heavy and unseen, stuck with me. In the days that followed, I noticed the smell of wet fur clinging faintly to the basement, lingering even after it had been cleaned. I never went down there alone at night again. Whenever I entered, I made sure someone else was in the house, and I kept the flashlight in hand. The basement never looked threatening in the daytime, but the memory of that night, the sounds, the shadows, the eyes under the workbench, made the space feel heavier than it ever had before. It reminded me that even familiar spaces can change in a single night, that the basement could hold surprises I didn't expect, and that something as simple as organizing tools could turn into a memory I would carry with me long after the smell of rust and oil had faded. I eventually finished organizing the workshop, but I always did it during the day. Every box put in order, every tool cleaned and set in place, was accompanied by a small, quiet relief that I was above ground, safe, and that the basement's dark corners would remain undisturbed. The memory of that night stayed with me, precise and tangible, a reminder of how a familiar space can feel entirely different once the world is quiet and you are alone. Even now, whenever I walk past the basement door, I can remember the weight of the shadows and the dragging sound of something that didn't belong, and I never forget to leave the light on. I remember the night clearly, even now, the way it unfolded in slow, creeping layers of unease. It was October 2021, a chilly, damp evening in suburban Ohio. The kind of night where the air clings to your skin and the streetlights glint off wet asphalt. My friends had dared me to spend 15 minutes alone in their basement. They insisted it was haunted, though I didn't really believe in that sort of thing. Still, I was 19, trying to prove myself, and I wanted to show them I wasn't scared. I knew the basement. I had been down there before to grab old boxes or help move things, but never alone and never at night. The basement itself was unfinished. Concrete floors, bare cinder block walls, and low ceilings with exposed pipes running haphazardly across the beams. Old insulation hung loose in places, and a faint mustiness filled the air, the smell of damp wood and cold stone. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the sound sharp in the quiet house. My friends stayed upstairs, whispering and laughing through the floorboards, their voices distant, slightly muffled. They handed me a small flashlight before I went down. It flickered intermittently, casting unstable pools of light on the walls. Shadows leapt and recoiled with every flicker, and the faint movement of cobwebs at the corners of the beams made me aware of how alive the darkness felt. At first, I tried to act brave, pacing slowly from one end of the basement to the other. My steps echoed softly, carrying through the empty space. The floor was cold under my sneakers, slightly slick with damp spots that reflected the flashlight in muted glints. The concrete smelled faintly sour, like old water that had stagnated in cracks, and each inhale carried a subtle metallic tang. I told myself it was just the house settling, just my imagination. I tried to focus on the walls, the exposed pipes, the stacked boxes in the far corner. Nothing should have been threatening. Nothing should have made me feel tense. But the basement was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and fills the gaps between your own breathing with anticipation. Around the 7-minute mark, the first real unease struck. I thought I heard something, a whisper, faint, almost beneath the threshold of hearing. It sounded like my name. I froze, convinced for a second that one of my friends was sneaking down the stairs to scare me. I told myself it was nothing, that the sound had to be from above, from somewhere in the house, but my heartbeat picked up anyway. The flashlight flickered again, longer this time, and the shadows on the walls swayed like living things. I tried to focus on the boxes, on the pipes, on anything I could recognize. The basement smelled stronger now, metallic and damp, like iron left out in water too long. It made my skin crawl. I started pacing again, taking small, deliberate steps, telling myself it was only a dare, that it would be over soon. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, elongating as the light flickered, and I caught glimpses of things out of the corner of my eye. Shapes that didn't belong, bending and twisting in ways a human body couldn't. Each time I spun my head toward the movement, the light stabilized, and nothing was there. Just the concrete floor, the walls, the scattered boxes, and the old furniture covered in dust. I laughed at myself quietly, trying to shake the feeling, but the basement seemed to breathe around me, the air thick and still, clinging to my skin like a weight. Then it happened. I was halfway through the dare, trying to convince myself I could handle it, when I felt it, a sudden, sharp heat at the back of my neck, like someone had leaned in too close. My skin prickled instantly. I smelled it before I understood it, a metallic scent, coppery and sharp, unmistakable. It made my stomach turn. I spun around, the flashlight tilting in my hand and then slipping from my grip. It rolled across the floor, clattering softly against the concrete before settling under the stairs. I froze, staring at the dark gap beneath the stairwell where it had disappeared. I got down on my hands and knees to retrieve it, moving slowly, carefully. My palms pressed into the cold floor, catching the faint damp that made the concrete slick. That's when I saw it, just for a moment. In the far corner, where the shadows pooled and the light didn't quite reach, there was a figure, hunched and grotesque in its posture. It moved strangely slowly, like something trying to imitate human movement, but failing. My breath caught, my heart hammering, and I realized I couldn't scream or move fast enough. The sight was enough to freeze me, my hands clutching the cold metal of the flashlight handle under the stairs. The shadow shifted slightly, and then it was gone, vanishing into the dark corner as if it had never been there. I screamed anyway, a raw, involuntary sound that reverberated through the basement walls. The sound of my scream brought my friends rushing down. Their laughter and whispers disappeared instantly, replaced by heavy steps on the stairs and frantic calls. By the time they reached the bottom, the basement was empty. Nothing was there except the boxes, the exposed pipes, and the faint, lingering wet smell that clung to the corners of the room and my clothes. The smell was subtle but persistent, like damp earth mixed with iron. I tried to explain what I had seen, but the words felt insufficient. My friends looked at me like I was exaggerating or imagining things, though I knew what I had felt, what I had seen, was real, or at least real enough to make my body respond as though it were. I stayed down there for the remainder of the dare with the flashlight in my hands, crouched against the wall, heart still racing, sweat sticking to my back. Every creak, every whisper of air, made me flinch. I traced the corners of the basement with the light, shining it on every shadow, every object. The cobwebs swayed even now, moving with a life of their own, though there was no draft. The smell stayed, mingling with the damp concrete and old wood, subtle but undeniable. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it had been my imagination, that the heat on my neck had been a draft or a trick of memory. But I knew better. The way the shadows had moved, the strange hunched shape, the metallic smell, it had been real enough to imprint itself on my mind. After 15 minutes, I climbed the stairs with my friends hovering nervously behind me. The house felt warmer upstairs, filled with familiar smells of carpet, wood, and faint traces of food. The basement door closed behind me, but the wet, metallic scent clung to my clothes and hair. I couldn't shake it, and I spent the rest of the night checking the windows and doors, even though I knew the basement was still locked and empty. Every time I glanced toward the stairwell, I felt the same prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I couldn't explain it. Nothing about that basement made sense in a rational way, and yet it had left a mark I couldn't ignore. I never went back into that basement alone. I avoided it for months, even when helping my friends move boxes or fix things. The unfinished space felt alive in ways that went beyond imagination, and the memory of that hunched shadow, the metallic smell, and the heat at my neck stayed with me. Eventually, I learned to live with it, to tell myself that some parts of the world aren't meant to be fully understood, that our brains are sensitive to the smallest cues in ways that can make ordinary spaces feel threatening. But every time I pass a dark basement or an unfinished concrete room, I feel that same tension creep up my spine, the faint smell of iron and wetness that lingers just at the edge of perception, reminding me of that October night when 15 minutes in a basement was enough to make me truly, profoundly afraid. Even now, years later, I can recall the flicker of that flashlight, the sway of the cobwebs, and the shape in the corner as clearly as if it happened yesterday. I don't need my friends to dare me again. I don't need to see the basement. I remember it all, and the memory alone is enough. It's not a ghost, not a monster, not even a human threat. It's just the basement, and somehow, that is enough to unsettle me completely. The lasting impression of that night wasn't fear in the moment alone. It was the realization of how ordinary places can suddenly become something else entirely, how a concrete room with exposed pipes and cobwebs can transform under your own perception, and how a small metallic smell, a flicker of light, and the hint of movement can be enough to make your body betray you. That basement, unfinished and ordinary, became a space that I carry with me, the memory of it precise, complete, and unshakable, a quiet reminder of just how real fear can feel when it is entirely grounded in the world around you. Even if you walked into it during the day, the basement might seem harmless. But for me, it will always hold that moment, my hands on the cold concrete, the flashlight rolling away, the hunched shadow in the corner, the smell, the heat, the creeping dread. And that is enough. Enough to make me pause every time I think about it. Enough to make me respect how fully ordinary spaces can become something else entirely. The basement isn't haunted by spirits. It's haunted by the memory of what our own senses and our own minds can convince us is real when the world turns slightly dark, slightly quiet, and slightly strange. I never stayed alone in a basement again. And I don't need to. The memory, the smell, the shape, the heat, they are all still there. And sometimes, in the quiet of my own home, I can almost feel it again, that weight on the back of my neck, the presence of something hunched in the corner, and the metallic tang that lingers in the air. It's not supernatural. It's just fear itself, distilled into a moment of absolute clarity, and it is something I will carry for the rest of my life. The basement taught me that some spaces are better left untested, that some dares are more dangerous than they appear, and that fear does not need monsters to make it feel real. It only needs a body, a mind, and a room that suddenly feels like it belongs to something else entirely. And I will always remember that night, the precise details of every shadow, every smell, every flicker of light, every movement that wasn't supposed to be there. It was all real, all grounded, and all enough to leave a mark I can still feel more than 3 years later. I rented the house in early August, drawn by the quiet streets and the low price for something that looked almost livable at first glance. It was the kind of place you could tell had been patched up here and there over decades, a mix of old wood floors, cracked plaster, and the faint, lingering smell of cleaning products that had long since lost their scent. I had been alone in the house for a few weeks, getting used to its creaks and the uneven hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. That night, I was preparing for a small gathering, a few friends stopping by late, and I realized I wanted a bottle of red from the cellar I had discovered just a few days before. The cellar was hidden behind what appeared to be a standard portion of the basement wall. At first, I hadn't noticed it, but while dragging a stack of boxes around during a cleaning session, a corner of the wall shifted slightly under my hand. It had a faint give, and when I leaned in and pushed, the wall moved, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I left the door slightly ajar for now, the light from the basement spilling out just enough to illuminate the first few steps. I had explored it briefly in daylight, noting the thick layer of dust on the floor, the old cobwebs strung across the corners, and the smell, a mix of mold, damp wood, and fermented grapes. The shelves were carved into the walls, stacked high with dusty bottles and wooden racks, many so old that I couldn't even read the labels. Some were coated in a grayish film of dust and mildew, others cracked or chipped at the edges, the corks dried and misshapen. I told myself I'd come back later for a closer look, but that night I simply wanted one of the newer bottles closer to the top, something safe and drinkable. I left the basement light on and carefully pushed the false wall closed behind me. The hinges creaked faintly, a dull, hollow sound that echoed down the narrow stairwell. I stepped carefully onto the first stair, Then the second, my bare feet pressing against the cold, slightly slick concrete. The air grew noticeably colder as I descended, damp and musty, thick enough that I could feel it in my lungs with each breath. My phone flashlight was the only source of light, its beam narrow and trembling slightly as I angled it toward the racks. The bottles were lined up neatly, even after decades of neglect. I ran my hand along a row, brushing off the dust on a label that had faded to illegibility, feeling the slight stickiness where the glass had absorbed moisture. The smell of fermented grapes was almost overpowering in the enclosed space, a combination of sweetness and rot, thick and clinging to my clothes. I took a deep breath, trying not to think too much about it, and reached for a bottle I recognized from a previous visit, the label faint but readable, a cheap Merlot from a local vineyard. I heard the first creak of the basement door above me and froze. The house was empty. I had turned off all other sources of noise, no fans running, no radio, and no one in the house but me. My heartbeat picked up slightly. The creak came again, a low, slow groan of wood settling, or so I told myself. I focused on the bottle, trying to calm my mind, but the silence seemed exaggerated, stretched too long, each second heavier than the last. Then I heard scratching. At first it was soft, almost imperceptible, like fingernails against wood. I paused, listening, trying to locate it. My flashlight beam swept over the racks, reflecting off the dusty glass of the bottles, catching the cobwebs in the corners, but nothing moved. The scratching continued, rhythmic, as if something was moving deliberately along the walls. I shifted the flashlight toward the source, and the sound stopped for a heartbeat. I held my breath, the darkness pressing in from all sides, the cool air smelling more sharply of mold. The scratching resumed, closer this time, along the far wall where the bottles were stacked unevenly. I realized the sound wasn't random. It was consistent, almost deliberate, the scrape and tap echoing off the concrete and wood. I gripped my phone tighter and stepped forward slowly, keeping my flashlight on the area where the noise came from. The shadows of the racks stretched across the walls, distorted and crawling in the dim light. I told myself it had to be a rat, or perhaps a bird trapped somewhere in the cellar. But the scratching didn't fit. It was too heavy, too precise, like claws dragging across wood. I adjusted my flashlight, sweeping it from floor to ceiling, trying to catch something moving, but again nothing. I took another step, and then a low growl rumbled from deeper in the cellar. My stomach dropped. I wasn't exaggerating. It wasn't a dog or a cat. The sound was guttural, deep, resonating in the walls and ceiling, vibrating through my chest. I stepped backward, my hand brushing against a bottle. It toppled over, rolling across the floor with a sharp clink. My heart raced. I shined the flashlight into the darkened corner from which the growl had come, trying to see something, anything, but only the gray dust and cobwebs met my gaze. Panic set in, but I knew I needed to get the bottle. I rationalized, telling myself it was an animal, probably a raccoon or a stray cat, that had found its way into the cellar somehow. I bent down and grabbed the bottle, feeling its weight in my hand, and immediately, the growl grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic scratching along the walls again. My skin prickled. I backed up toward the stairs, stepping over broken bottles and knocking a few more to the floor. The sound was everywhere now, surrounding me, pressing in from the walls and the corners, echoing in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint. I didn't pause. My feet slipped slightly on the damp concrete, and I scrambled upward, using the walls for balance. The staircase seemed narrower than I remembered, and the air grew heavier with each step. My lungs burned with the effort of climbing, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack my chest. The growl followed me, fading slightly as I reached the upper stairs, then returned with renewed intensity as I stepped onto the last stair. I shoved the wall closed behind me, the hinges straining under the sudden pressure, and the scraping abruptly stopped. I stood in the basement proper, breathing heavily, the bottle clutched to my chest, trying to calm myself. My phone light flickered slightly, and in that instant, I thought I saw movement among the racks in the far corner of the basement. A shadow shifted behind the dusty glass, a blur that could have been anything, a trick of the light, a reflection, but my nerves refused to let me dismiss it. I kept my eyes fixed on that spot, rocking slightly on my heels, the chill of the basement pressing against my damp skin. I carried the bottle upstairs carefully, my steps measured, listening intently for any sound behind me. The rest of the house was silent, every creak, groan, and settling echo of wood and air magnified in the stillness of the night. I set the bottle on the counter in the kitchen, ran cold water over my hands, and tried to steady my breathing. My muscles ached from the adrenaline, my heart still racing, but I told myself it was over. Nothing had actually attacked me. Nothing had come from the cellar. It was probably just the house settling, the wind, a small animal, anything that could explain the noise without reaching for anything improbable. Still, every so often, I found myself glancing toward the basement door. Even with the lights on, even with the walls closed and the false entry secured, the thought of what I had heard lingered. My imagination played tricks, turning the shadows behind the glass racks into shapes that moved just out of reach, teasing me with glimpses of something I could never fully see. I eventually carried the bottle to the living room, set it on the table, and tried to focus on preparing the rest of the space for my friends. Sleep didn't come that night. I kept imagining the cellar, the damp smell, the darkness pressing in, the scraping along the walls. I pictured the shelves and the bottles, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the corners, and the growl echoing in the empty space. Morning brought light, which dulled the intensity of the memory, but the unease remained. I decided to avoid the cellar for a while, convincing myself that there was nothing there that I hadn't seen during daylight. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I returned to the cellar, this time in the afternoon, sunlight streaming in through the small basement window. I opened the false wall carefully, descended the stairs, and shined my flashlight across the racks, examining every corner. Everything was exactly as it should be. No signs of disturbance, no claw marks, no evidence of any animal. The bottles were intact except for those I had accidentally knocked over. The dust and mildew smelled the same, thick and sweet, but harmless. I spent more time that day cataloging the bottles, noting labels and dates, occasionally brushing the dust off with my hands. The cellar was vast, narrow, but orderly, a hidden pocket of history beneath the house. It became almost comforting, a quiet retreat when the main house felt too empty. But even with the light and the knowledge of what was there, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The growl, the scratching, the way the darkness seemed alive in a way it hadn't before. I never did discover exactly what caused the noise. There were no animals in the house, no structural problems that could explain the scraping in that pattern. But I stopped going into the cellar at night, sticking to daylight visits only. The fear had lessened with rational explanation, but it had left its mark. Every time I went to retrieve a bottle in the months that followed, I felt the same chill of the air, the same oppressive stillness, and the same need to keep moving, to avoid lingering too long in the corners. Eventually, the cellar became a quiet fascination. I collected a few bottles, studied them, sometimes sat on the stairs just to feel the cool dampness against my legs. But I never again descended into that hidden space after dark. The house was old, the basement narrow and cold, and the memory of that night reminded me that some spaces, even in the familiar and mundane, could feel more alive than you expected. The cellar remained intact, untouched by anything but my own hand, a secret beneath the floorboards that reminded me to respect the silence and the shadows in ways I had never considered before. Even years later, whenever I see a darkened basement door, I feel that twinge of unease, that memory of cold air thick with mold and the faint smell of grapes, and I remember the growl, the rhythmic scraping, and the way I had sprinted upward with my heart in my throat, the echo of something real, pressing close enough to remind me that even in an ordinary house, there were corners I would never truly understand.